convenient, I socialize.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all here. I hope you're enjoying time with one another and a simple lunch. I'm so excited for the next 3 days that we have faculty from Emory's Candler School of Theology, particularly from the Candler Foundry, here to teach us about discipleship and doubt. We're going to be looking at the Passion narrative according to the Gospel of Mark. And today we begin with our very good friend, Ryan Bonfiglio, who is known, for those of you who come to adult formation events, for being the best teacher that we have here. He's our favorite. And really, we're just so grateful for that he and his colleagues who will be here the next couple days bring such richness of intellectual rigor, but also especially asking the so what and the relevance to our life. And so he will be doing that for us today. Ryan is associate professor in the practice of Old Testament. His scholarship focuses on biblical metaphors, ancient Near Eastern art, and the theology and practice of Sabbath. I kind of wish you were just telling us how to rest today. Maybe you could add that in somehow. Alongside his Old Testament teaching and research, he serves as the executive director of the Candler Foundry. And so I will invite Ryan up. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Appreciate it. Well, friends, good afternoon. It is great to be with you. I've always considered All Saints, or at least for a very long time, my church home away from home. My wife is a pastor, so that is my church home for many reasons, including the health of my marriage. But it is great to be with you all. It's great to worship here and to be a part of this Passion Week in this program. Now, I know it is Passion Week. I know it is almost April. I know it is Lent. But I want to begin taking you back to another liturgical time, Advent. See, every Thanksgiving, just about when Advent is beginning, my family pulls out from this closet this massive nativity set. Maybe you do something the same in your family. Now, I'm a professor of the Bible. My wife's a pastor. So you would expect, not surprisingly, our nativity set to be the deluxe edition. It is massive. It sprawls across the whole mantle in our living room. And there's all sorts of people in it. There's Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus. There's the shepherds and the wise guys, sometimes known as the wise men. There's the camels, the sheep. There's the manger. There's the inn. There's all sorts of stuff. And then there's a bunch of other people. I don't even know what they are or what they're supposed to do. I've read the Gospels. They're not in the Gospels, but they're on our mantle. In fact, so crowded is our mantle that this past Christmas, I was hanging the stockings, on the mantle, and I was putting in this little nail, hammering ever so gingerly, but the vibrations of the hammer caused Joseph to fall off the mantle, splat on the hard floor, instant decapitation. Now, fortunately, that was bad. Fortunately, though, we have so many extra characters in our nativity set, I just moved another dude into place, and he was instant Joseph, and no one else knew because this other figure didn't have a role to play anyway. Now, I love nativity sets, but here's the thing. Nativity sets actually are quite deceiving. Why? Because in no single gospel account are all of the elements in your nativity set present, right? A nativity set pulls from all of the different gospels and crowds all of the figures together in one story. For instance, the wise men, they're only found in Matthew's gospel, whereas the shepherds are only in Luke's gospel. The inn and the manger, that's only Luke. The star, only in Matthew. So the nativity set pulls, the angels, by the way, there's always angels. Matthew and Luke have angels, multiple angels, but they do different things, and they talk to different people. All of them get smashed together in our nativity set, and it harmonizes the story that we know of Christmas. Are you with me? Well, it turns out the same thing that's true of Christmas and our nativity sets is also true of this week. of the end of Jesus' life and accounts of the passion. Now, there's no such thing as a little passion display that you put on your mantles, at least not that I have in the Presbyterian tradition that I'm from. But we do have paintings of the passion story, like this 15th century piece of art from a Flemish artist that combines all of the elements of the passion story into one single painting. Now, I know it's a little bit difficult to see here, but if you could see this up close and in better light, you would see that all of the scenes of the passion of Jesus' last week, they're there. Here's the place where Peter cuts off the ear of the guard who comes to arrest Jesus. Or, in this other scene, this is where Jesus stumbles, and Simon the Cyrene comes and helps carry the cross for Jesus for a moment. Or if you go to the upper right of the painting, you see a couple different things. One, you see Jesus being nailed to the cross, kind of in your center left. And then if you move upwards and to the right just slightly, you see the crucifixion, and you actually see the women taking Jesus' body down from the cross. Here again, this scene does not match any of the Gospels as we have them. It's a harmonization of elements from all four Gospels. Not all of this stuff occurs in any single Gospel. It's a harmonization in the same way that our nativity sets are a harmonization. Are you with me? This tendency to bring all the Gospels together, whether it's about the birth of Jesus or the death of Jesus, reflects our tendency to make what I call gospel smoothies. So each gospel is an individual fruit. We throw it into the blender, we hit the button, 30 seconds later, out comes this delicious, wonderful, completely harmonized gospel smoothie. This is our tendency, and it's actually something that the church has done really for hundreds and hundreds of years. Going back to about the 7th century, there were these things, actually a little bit earlier than that, there were these things that called gospel harmonies, where people would actually take the elements of a gospel story and combine it together into one harmonized piece of literature. What's the value of the gospel smoothie? What's the value of taking all of the elements from all of the individual Gospels and putting them together in one? Why might that be helpful? Let's get a response or two. By the way, this will be interactive. I have questions for you. You can ask questions for me. If you've had me in class before, you know my rule. If you make eye contact, that counts as raising your hand. So just be really, really, really careful about that. So Anne, please. You get a complete picture, right? It's all there in the nativity set. All of the story, all in one, right? That's really helpful. And why is that complete picture helpful? Let's go a little further with that. Why might that be nice to have?
Because it's unified.
It's unified. I like that answer.
And then the purpose of all of that is, of course, the resurrection, what comes on.
Yeah.
But it's unification.
It's unification, right? So you can imagine maybe you're teaching a kid the story of Christmas or the story of the Passion. It would be helpful not to have 4 different nativity sets, but just to have one or 4 different pictures. Now in this gospel, but you want it to all come together maybe for a pedagogical reason. There was another hand, I think. Was there one more? Please.
Maybe it makes you feel better. You don't have to question anything, right? There's nothing to question.
Right, we don't have to, there's nothing to question, meaning maybe if you're reading Matthew side by side of Luke, you might wonder, well, where are the wise men in Luke and where are the shepherds in Matthew? And is this an error? Is this a mistake? Why didn't Luke include this, right? So maybe bringing them all together, that harmonization makes it easier, or maybe it answers some questions, right? All of these are really good reasons to harmonize the gospel. But now let me ask the opposite question. Why might it be helpful to resist the tendency to make gospel smoothies? Why might it be helpful, to use our metaphor, to go back to the individual fruits, if each fruit is a gospel on its own? What might be helpful about that? Please.
Well, each narrative is emphasizing something, so on what they include, you're trying to get a sense of what is the message of this gospel.
Yes. So each gospel, each author of the gospel, they're all seeing the same thing. They're all experiencing the same Jesus, the same realities. But the way they're telling those stories, they're to different audiences, And they want to emphasize different themes or different theology. So there's a unique message. So you might imagine Jenny, Simon, and Andy all have sermons on the same text, right? Same scripture. I imagine those three sermons would sound different, right? They would be about the same text. There might be a common thread and some common themes, right? They wouldn't be wholly different, but you might detect a different emphasis in Simon's sermon than in Andy's, than in Jenny's. Well, the same is true of our different gospels. They go together, but they each have their own preaching voice, if you will. Anything else? What else would be helpful about going back to the individual fruits? Please.
Well, Mark has Jesus really enacted that.
Yeah.
Like, what's happening? Why am I here? I've been forsaken.
That's right.
And as you move forward to John, everybody, happy days are here again.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're really different depictions of a lot of things, but particularly of the Passion. It's interesting that the Gospels differ. You could make an argument that the Gospels differ most from one another at the beginning and at the end. The middle stuff is more similar. There's some exceptions to that, but the middle stuff is more similar. The differences are on the beginning and the ends. So we might pay attention to that difference, and we might ask, what difference does the difference make? If Mark tells it this way, what's the point of that? What's the message? What's the theology? What are we supposed to pay attention to? What are we meant to learn? Please.
Yeah, the word that pops to mind is authenticity.
Yeah.
They're more authentic, coming from four different people with their points of view and their observation and perspectives.
That's exactly right. It's more authentic. If they each told the same story in the same way, I actually might be a little bit suspicious. If this was a Candler classroom, I would wonder if maybe they work together outside of the parameters of the syllabus to come up with the same answer. So I like this idea that there's some authenticity in this. Well, friends, this is great. Love, beautiful insights. Here's what we want to do starting today and then going into tomorrow and then on Wednesday. Me and my colleagues from Candler, who are New Testament instructors, we're going to think together about how to unharmonize the Gospels. We want to go back to the individual fruit of one particular Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, and we want to think about the Passion narrative in Mark, and in particular, we want to think about the theme of discipleship in the Gospel of Mark. Now, why Mark? Why the Passion? Why discipleship? Well, for one, Mark's presentation of the Passion, and when I use that word passion, I'm going to mean that sort of as a cover term for the whole last week of Jesus' life. What's interesting about Mark is that Mark's account of the Passion is the longest account of all four Gospels. Now that's interesting in its own right, but it's even more interesting because Mark's Gospel is the shortest Gospel of all four. So think about that. The shortest Gospel spends the most amount of time on the Passion. 7 of Mark's 16 chapters are on the Passion. Some people have actually said that Mark's Gospel is a Passion narrative with an extended introduction. So we want to think together a little bit over these days about why is Mark spending so long on the Passion? What does that tell us? What sense do we make of that? That's number one. Number two, when it comes to the distinctions between the four Gospels, one of the points of distinction is how the disciples are presented. How the disciples are presented. Now, in all four Gospels, there are disciples. There are followers of Jesus. In all four Gospels, those disciples are called to leave families and jobs to come follow Jesus. And in all four Gospels, the disciples do that. And in all four Gospels, the disciples, guess what? Like me and you, they're not perfect. They get some things wrong along the way. They make mistakes. They don't fully understand. That's true of all four Gospels. But in Mark, the disciples fail all the time. All the time. Mark's story, and particularly the Passion story, is a study in the failure of the disciples. It's almost as if Mark has assembled for us a bloopers reel around discipleship. And instead of hiding those stories away, right, Mark pushes them to the front of the table and says, look, pay attention to this. Pay attention to how Peter and James and John and all of the other disciples don't get it. And so what we want to think about, we want to zoom in on some of those themes. I'm going to start us there, and then my colleagues are going to continue that. We're going to look at particular passages, mostly in the Passion story, of the failure of discipleship. We're going to notice how are they failing, what's going on, what are they misunderstanding, and then more importantly, we're going to reflect on what is Mark's theology of discipleship. What is he telling us about what it means to have faith and to follow Jesus through these stories of disciples failing? And one of the things that we're going to see is that in Mark's gospel, doubt is not the opposite of faith. For Mark, doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's not a barrier to discipleship. In Mark, doubt is actually a part of discipleship. It's a bridge to deeper knowledge of God. It's an invitation into understanding God's mystery. And I think that's important, friends, because I want to suggest that doubt plays the same role in our life, in your life. I suspect, we don't have to raise hands here, that all of you have doubts about life, about faith, about God, maybe even about Scripture. I hope this study helps you put that doubt in a different place. Not doubt. Please hear me. This study is not to convince you not to doubt, but it's to invite a different way of thinking about the doubt that you have according to the Gospel of Mark. Make sense? Okay. Well, let's look at a couple scenes of this theme of doubt and discipleship in Mark's Gospel. And I have to pull back up my notes. Hang on a second. All right, let's start. We're going to show you just kind of a couple preliminary scenes about doubt in the Passion narrative. And just first, before we do that, just a little bit of kind of context here about the Passion story. The Passion story in Mark begins in chapter 10, really, and that's when Jesus leaves that place. Now, in Mark at this point, that place is the Galilee. That's the northern part of the ancient land of Israel. See if my little pointer works. See this area up here, Galilee. That's where Jesus spent most of his life. Nazareth is up there. That's where the Sea of Galilee is. I know that's a big surprise there. The Sea of Galilee is in the Galilee. Yes, I know. This is years of education on display here. Jesus spends all of his life up there in the Galilee. Jesus left that place and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Judea is way down here in the south. Where is my little pointer? Sorry, I cannot. This is this is a challenge to my eye-hand coordination. Jerusalem is in Judea. So in Mark, it's not until this last week of Jesus' life that he makes the journey from up north in the Galilee to down south in Judea. John has Jesus in Judea all the time. I don't know what John's doing. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke say Jesus is in the Galilee, and only once in his final week does he really come down south to Judea. And interestingly, little side note, so by the time we get to chapter 11, when they were approaching Jerusalem, so it takes one chapter to make the journey from the Galilee up north down to Judea in the south. Remember, this land is not super big. Israel back then was about the size of New Jersey. So you're basically going from Trenton to Cape May. If you know, you know. It's not that far of a journey. In Mark, it takes one chapter. Now, interestingly, in Luke, this journey takes 10 chapters. This is one of those areas where Luke is much bigger than Mark. Luke's gospel is 72%, I did the math, longer than Mark's. And it's in part because this journey to Jerusalem takes 10 chapters in Luke. And by the way, that's where we find all of the parables. All of Luke's parables are told as Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. That's a really important framework to keep in mind. Whenever you hear a parable, you have to imagine Jesus is telling these stories as he's going to Jerusalem to be condemned, sentenced to death, and rise again. That context is the context we always need to hear the parables in. Anyway, Mark gets us here in chapter 11, and then the rest of the time is the last week of Jesus' life, from 11 on. And sure enough, right at the very beginning of this journey, we see a classic scene of the failure of the disciples. And it involves these two guys, two brothers, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Now, whatever you assume about sibling relationships, rivalries, contentions, apply them here. They all apply. James and John are arguing, and they asked Jesus to give us a seat of honor when you come into your glory. Give us a seat on the right and on the left of your throne. I can only imagine the brothers squabbling over who gets the right seat and who gets the left seat. Like, one of them is definitely called shotgun here. I suspect it's John, but I'm not entirely sure. So they ask of this of Jesus, and they said to him, appoint us to sit, one at your right hand, one at your left. But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. If I were translating, I would say, you're out of your minds. You have not been paying attention. You've not been listening to everything I have said to you so far, James and John, because sure enough, in the verses right before this, oops, that was too quick. The verses right before this, Jesus has told them, but many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Apparently, James and John were not listening to that, because verses later, they're asking, can I have the seat of honor? Can I sit at your seat? Will I get the privilege of being at your right hand, oh Jesus? You can just imagine Jesus. I think there are these moments, friends, I'm using my imagination here, where Jesus rolls his eyes at the disciples. I can't believe it. Are there not other people who will leave their jobs and follow me? I imagine Jesus saying this. So what's the problem here? What are they misunderstanding about discipleship? How would you put it in your words? Okay, trust. Maybe something about trust. Service, I like that. Service? Costly. Following Jesus is costly. Humility. Absolutely. Yeah, this is really, really good. The way I would put it, and it's just another way of saying everything you have said, is that they misunderstand what it means to be chosen to be a disciple. You see, they thought of chosenness. I've been called and chosen to be a disciple to be an invitation to honor. They think it's about prestige and privilege and prerogative, and Jesus is like, no. To be chosen is about responsibility. It's not about privilege. It's not about prerogative. It's not about prestige. It's about responsibility. And sure enough, when we go back to the Old Testament, which of course back then wasn't old, it was just Testament. That's all they read was the Old Testament. I kind of would have fit in back then. I would have liked that. Anyway, if you look at the idea of chosenness in the Old Testament, it's always about responsibility and never about privilege. You are chosen to do something. Right? In fact, I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine about this one time, this idea of chosenness. And he said, yeah, in Judaism, chosenness means you don't have a choice. And that struck me. I was like, tell me about that. He said, yeah, to be a chosen people, means that you don't have a choice with respect to the responsibilities you have. And I think what he said actually really gets at the Old Testament idea and Jesus' idea of what it means to be chosen. It's not about privilege. It's not about priority. It's not about prestige. It's about a responsibility that you don't get to opt out of. That's the you don't have a choice part of chosenness. And I think that's what James and John misunderstand. They're understanding discipleship as a seat of honor. And Jesus is saying, the last will be first. The first will be last. Come, follow me to the cross. Note where I'm going. You're going there too. You with me? This is number one. This is scene number one of the failure of the disciples. Oh, let me show you one other cool thing. So interestingly, Matthew has this story as well. Okay, so you might think, well, wait a second. I thought the failure of discipleship is only in Mark. Well, Matthew has this story as well, but Matthew frames it a little bit differently. Let me read it, and I want to see if you can detect what Matthew has done. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked a favor of him. And he said to her, what do you want? She said to him, declare that these two sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. But Jesus answered, you do not know what you are asking. What's the difference, and what difference does it make? Do you see it? The mom does the asking, right? And how does that make it better, in a way? Or at least how does it make it better for James and John?
They're not responsible for the ask.
Oh, that's right, totally. They're not responsible for the ask. And how can you blame a mother for wanting the best for her two kids? Right? What doting mother wouldn't want seats of honor for their kids, right? So, at worst, in Matthew's version, this is just the overzealousness of a loving mother. But in Mark's version, no. These are two brothers squabbling over positions of honor. So do you see what happens there? Two stories, they're both in Mark and Matthew, but Matthew changes it ever so slightly. Now you might ask me, how did it really go? Which one is right? We don't know. We only know these two different versions of framing it. I have a suspicion, this is just Ryan here, I have a suspicion that Mark's is original and that Matthew softens it by adding the mother, because Matthew is afraid in some ways of the disciples failing. And Mark says, nope, that's what disciples do. They fail, and that's what we need to pay attention to. Are you with me? Make sense? Questions so far? We doing okay? All right, let me show you a second scene. In Mark, the disciples never fully understand who Jesus is. It's really interesting. The people closest to Jesus never fully get it. One way we see this is that in Mark, the disciples are always calling Jesus rabbi. Now, in Hebrew, rabbi means great one, and it's a title for a teacher. It's almost like saying professor or doctor or something like that. And so it's partly right. Jesus was a teacher in many regards. He's often teaching people from the scriptures and new ways of understanding. But interestingly, in the other Gospels, the term rabbi is not typically used of Jesus. Luke never uses rabbi for Jesus because Luke's like, this is the Son of God. Be really clear. This is not some teacher. This is not some rabbi. This is the Son of God. Now, that's Luke. Matthew does use rabbi on a couple of occasions. Not that one, sorry, it's not on the screen. Matthew uses the term rabbi 3 times. It's all one person, whoever uses the term rabbi for Jesus. Any guesses of who it is? It's someone who doesn't get it. Not Peter. Peter does better in Matthew. He's going to have a problem in Mark. It's Judas. The one who betrays Jesus is the one who misunderstands who Jesus is. It's only Judas who calls Jesus rabbi. Isn't that interesting in the Gospel of Matthew? So it's used, but clearly for Matthew, this is the wrong title. But in Mark, the disciples freely call Jesus rabbi, in part because they don't get the whole thing. It's not that rabbi, so if this was a test, you would get partial credit for rabbi, because Jesus is a rabbi, but you wouldn't get full credit, because Jesus is much more than a rabbi. Now, interestingly, in 2 places in Mark, someone gets it. Someone is like, yep, I know who this is. This is God. This is the Son of God. We see it in 2 places. Mark 5:7, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. And then again in Mark 15:39, truly this man was God's Son. Does anyone know who says these things? Jenny?
Mary Magdalene, right?
Not Mary Magdalene. Yeah, the first one is a demon. So a demon. So it's the centurion guard, the Roman guard at the end. So get this. The only people in Mark who really get that Jesus is the Son of God are not disciples.
The demon and the lawyer, right?
Yeah, the demon and sort of a Gentile centurion who watches Jesus die on the cross. So that's interesting. Only the not disciples get that Jesus really is the Son of God. Mark is commenting on this all the time. He's saying, wait a second, the disciples never fully get it. Now, Peter, he gets it, sort of, kind of, in one place. This is just at the beginning of that journey down to Judea from the Galilee. Jesus asked them, his disciples, but who do you say that I am? Jesus is giving him the softball. Here it is. Just give me, I've told you the answer, now give it to me. Just give it back, 100% credit. And Peter's that guy in the classroom. If you had this kid, call me, I got the right answer. So Peter jumps right in. He's that guy, he's that student. You pretend not to see him, but he's there, he's in the front row. And Peter says, you are the Messiah. Finally, the right answer, right? Finally, someone gets it in Mark. Yay, Peter. But if we keep reading, we immediately see that Peter doesn't understand what a Messiah is. Because here's what happens. Jesus starts talking about the type of Messiah he is. Jesus says, Mark says, then he, Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he said all of this quite openly. And Peter takes Jesus aside, hearing what he said about a Messiah. I'm a Messiah who will suffer, who will be condemned, who will die, who will rise again. And Peter rebukes him. In Mark, that language of rebuke is what Jesus does to demons. And now Mark is rebuking Jesus for talking about the sort of the Messiah he wanted to be. Why? Because for Peter, the Messiah was a military figure. He was a political figure. He would who would overthrow the Roman authorities and set up a new Jewish-centered state, a Jewish nationalism, if you will, that would stand in place of Rome. And Jesus says, that's not my calling. I'm called to suffer and die and rise again. And Peter, so much didn't want that he rebukes Jesus for talking about the type of Messiah that he would be. So even in giving the right answer, do you see what's happening? Even in giving the right answer, Peter doesn't get it. He misunderstands what type of Messiah. He is not willing to have a Messiah that suffers, dies, and rises again. Peter wants the military political Messiah who will overthrow Rome. But again, that's not who Jesus is, not here in this text. Make sense? Questions? Let me pause here. How are we on time? Okay, we need to wrap soon. How are we on time? That was a question to me that I said out loud. How are you doing? What questions do you have? I'm going to show you one last thing. Please.
Okay, so in this portion, Jesus, I guess, calls himself the Son of Man.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of meanings to
Yeah.
the Son of Man.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a complicated term. It's a term used in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Daniel. And in that context, it just sort of means the human one. It means sort of someone who has a humanity in them. So in calling Jesus the Son of Man, I think Mark is connecting us to the humanity of Jesus. Now, that term comes to have other connotations as well, but I think at the time that's sort of the basic referent, is that this is God, but he's God incarnate. He's God in the form of a human one, in an enfleshed one.
Why the secret, Jesus?
Oh, yeah. Why do you think about keeping things secret? Such a good question. Everywhere, this is another important theme in Mark, the secrecy motif in Mark. Matthew doesn't have it, Luke doesn't have it, John doesn't have it. Every time the disciples seemingly get close to the right answer, Jesus says, shh, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. And there's some question about what that means. Why would Jesus always be trying to keep things a secret? And there's a couple ways to understand it. One is that it was reverse psychology. I one time was planning a surprise party for my wife. My son was about 5. And to tell him to keep it a secret was like telling him, go announce this to every neighbor and your mom as often as possible. Sometimes kids or adults will do the opposite of what they're told. So that's maybe one mentality of it, or one possibility of it. Another possibility is that the word for secret in Gospel of Mark is the Greek word mysterion, from which we get mystery. And so it's not so much like a secret as in like, I've got a secret, I'm just going to tell this person over here. But it's like this grand mystery. Maybe what Mark understands is that you could talk to people about this, but even talking about it is not going to get at the full mystery of it. In order to really get the mystery of Jesus, the mystery of God, you can't just hear a story about what Jesus did. You have to encounter Jesus, and in particular, the resurrected Lord. It's only when you encounter the resurrected Lord that the mystery is broken open, that you really get it. A third way of understanding it is that the disciples are always keeping things a secret. They're getting it wrong. They're keeping it a secret. And as readers of the gospel, that means that we are to step in place of the disciples. We are the ones to understand. We are the ones to tell the secret that the disciples never could tell. In other words, we are in place of the faithful disciple in Mark. We are the ones to go out and pronounce the good news of the resurrection. Jen Quigley, my colleague, is actually one of her lessons is going to be on the very ending of Mark, which very weirdly doesn't tell of the resurrection. And she's going to help us think about, well, why is that? And what does that invite us into as readers of this story? But more on that on Wednesday. Let me do this to wrap up. Jenny knows that one of my spiritual gifts is to prepare more content than I possibly could ever have time to teach, and Jenny, I am true to form here today. So let me just kind of bring us into a little bit of summary and so what for what we have seen. So we've seen that in Mark, the disciples really don't get it. They misunderstand priorities, they don't understand the kingdom, they really don't fully get who Jesus is. This is the bloopers reel. And I think for Mark, this is not an expose. Mark is not trying to make the disciples look bad, or he is, but there's a deep theological purpose to what Mark is doing in showing us the failure of the disciples. And I think this is where it really comes back to us. And so I want to make 3 final points that won't take but another 45 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes. Number 1, I think what Mark is doing is to normalize doubt as a part of discipleship. It's a way of saying, look, you have doubts about Jesus, you have doubts about theology, you have doubts about how our world can be falling apart and God still can be sovereign. Join the boat, join the company. You're not alone. Even Peter and James and John, the pillars of the church, had doubts. You don't have to think of doubt as the opposite of faith. Doubt for Mark is a part of faith. When I was in college and first coming of age of faith, I was in a campus ministry group that leaned pretty far right. And I remember them saying that when we came to church, we had to leave our doubts at the door. As if doubts would be a hindrance to an encounter of a sermon or the Eucharist or any sacrament of the church or an encounter in fellowship. And I believed that. And I felt deeply the cognitive dissonance of having doubts, but also being a person of faith. Those doubts were alongside of my faith, but they didn't render my faith null and void. But I felt shameful about that. I felt like I had to hang up those doubts like a hat or a coat as I entered the sanctuary. And as a result, I couldn't be authentic. I couldn't bring my full self into faith. And I think Mark is saying, no. Bring those doubts with you. That is faith, to bring doubts with you into the place of worship. Mark normalizes it and says, it's okay. It's okay to have that. There is no shame in whatever doubt you have. That is part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. In fact, I would go so far, point 2, to say that not only is doubt not a barrier to faith for Mark, but I think Mark would say doubt is a bridge to faith in many respects. The term disciple in Greek, mathetes, means learner. It means someone who follows, someone who is curious, someone who asks questions. And for me, I find that my best students are not the ones who have all the answers, but are the ones who are committed to asking good and better questions. And I've often wondered, after Peter gets it so wrong about the Messiah, and as they're walking down to Judea, that pathway, I wonder what happened to Peter. The text doesn't tell us, by the way, but I can imagine Peter having questions and asking questions and wondering, wait, what is a Messiah? I can imagine him going back to the Old Testament, flipping through and saying, wait, what did I misunderstand? I imagine that the doubts and the things that the disciples get wrong actually are the bridge to a deeper understanding of who Jesus is. And I think Mark is signaling that that is part of discipleship. Doubt can be a bridge to faith. And then finally, I think Mark would say that doubt is the only appropriate response to the mystery of God. We already talked about secrecy. I was going to bring it up here, that this idea of a secrecy of the divine in Mark is a mystery. For Mark, maybe more than any other gospel, Jesus is a mystery, a profound mystery, a mystery that we can't possibly wrap our minds around. Even the best rabbi, the most pious priest, can't wrap their minds around the mystery of God. Mark gets that arguably more than any other gospel, and he says, look, the only appropriate response to mystery is some measure of doubt. Because Mark, I think, would think, if he was here, he would say, look, if you don't doubt, you don't really get it. If you don't have some doubt, you've not really encountered the mystery of God. If you don't doubt, you've domesticated Jesus into a nice guy who lived a long time ago, who taught some good things about loving your neighbor, and that's it. Mark says Jesus was more than that. And if you don't doubt, you don't get it. So friends, for these reasons, discipleship and doubt aren't opposites in Mark. They're two sides of the same coin. They have to go together. They're part of what it means to encounter Jesus in this final week of his life. And it's part of what it means for you and I to encounter Jesus in this week as we lead up to the good news of the resurrection. Thank you all very much.
I'm just saying, come back tomorrow, and same time, same place, different instructor, but obviously same topic. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at noon.